Welcome to the Bulwark podcast. I am Charlie Sykes. Rather extraordinary moment at the United Nations yesterday where Volodymyr Zelensky, who holds nothing back. I know that it's become, same old to talk about, how powerful he is as a speaker and as a leader, but also as a truth teller, a blunt truth teller, a speaking truth to power figure. And he's speaking to the Security Council of the United Nations and basically suggesting that you guys are pretty worthless. I just read this quote. Where is the security that the Security Council needs to guarantee? It's not there, although there is a Security Council. So where is the peace? Where are the guarantees that the United Nations needs to guarantee? And then he goes there. He says, show how we can reform and work for peace. Otherwise, he says, you should dissolve yourself altogether if there is nothing you can do besides conversation. Wow. I do think this is one of those moments, although I feel we've had so many of those in the past where the United Nations has to decide whether it's going to go the way of the League of Nations. For you history nerds out there, the League of Nations really, fell apart in the late 1930s when it failed to stand up to aggression. I believe, I think the trigger was really when they decided they were going to do nothing about Mussolini's invasion of Ethiopia. And people said, okay, you guys are completely worthless. And they were completely worthless. So it does raise the question, what is the point of a United Nations that has Russia on the Human Rights Council and that sits and watches this kind of aggression, the ongoing war crimes and atrocities, and decides that it can't do anything about it? What is the point of the body? Well, there's so much to talk about today, and we are joined once again by our good friend Josh Kraushaar from the National Journal. Welcome back to the podcast, Josh.
Hey, Charlie, good to be back on the show.
Well, we have a lot to talk about, both internationally and domestically. Just sort of top of mind for me, I know that you have been an observer of CPAC over the years, the shift in the Conservative Political Action Committee, which is really kind of, again, it's been described as the Star Wars bar scene of the conservative movement, but it's a good indicator of where the right is going. They are going ahead with having their conference in Hungary next month, which I find extraordinary on so many different levels. I want to get your take on all of that. That CPAC, which used to be, was founded on no small government and liberty and everything, and they've decided that they're going to go celebrate Viktor Orban, Europe's number one pro-Putin autocrat, and they're going there now in the midst of this war. Just your thoughts about that choice?
Well, Charlie, CPAC always didn't represent the electorate of the Republican Party, even in its heyday, even when it was more popular, I don't think it was ever mainstream per se, but when it had a little bit more of the Republican Party
Yeah.
zeitgeist. But it's really fascinating to see how far off the deep end it's gone on foreign policy. At the same time that this, and I would call it the Nat, what is it? They call themselves the NatCons, the National
Yeah.
Conservatives. This wing is less and less popular, even among Republicans, in its
Yeah.
views on Russia, Ukraine, in its views on America's role in the world. Yet you're seeing them meeting in Hungary and feeding the Orban, who just got reelected as leader of Hungary. But this is a very small group in terms of our elective politics of folks like, JD Vance, a candidate for Senate in
Right.
Ohio, Marjorie Taylor Greene, Tucker Carlson on Fox News, Sarab Amari, among so-called intellectuals.
Donald Trump.
But yeah, I mean, you could argue Trump is sort of the champion, or at least the defender of some of these folks. But in terms of the actual policy, the actual substance, you look at the polling, Charlie. You've talked about it a lot on
Yeah,
this
right.
show. An overwhelming number of Republicans are not anti-Putin. They're very much supportive of Ukraine's effort to defend themselves against these horrors that Russia has caused upon them. And they don't entertain this sort of "I don't care about what's going on in Ukraine" point of view that JD Vance, most notably, has advocated on the Senate campaign trail in Ohio. I think we'll have some early tests. Ohio's Senate primary is coming up next
Yeah.
month, so Vance has been struggling in that race. We'll see where it ends up going. But if he can't win in Ohio in a crowded Republican primary with that message, it's hard to see it translating anywhere else. You've also got a Blake Masters, who's a Senate candidate in Arizona.
Right.
That's an August primary. But these are true tests of whether this Nat Khan message has any standing even within the Republican Party.
I think that's a good point. The point I made in my newsletter this morning, though, is that obviously it's become increasingly toxic for anyone to rationalize or defend anything that Vladimir Putin is doing. People are backing off on all of that. You're not going to see Tucker Carlson say, I am rooting for Russia anymore. Even Tulsi Gabbard seems to think that this might be damaging her brand. I mean, who knew? Atrocities on the evening news every night. To a certain extent, they've become anti Putin. What I'm floating is the idea that they're kind of laundering their Putinism through Orban. That Orban gives them the autocratic vibe without the body count, without the genocide. But it is interesting that we get the announcement that they're going there like a couple days after he is reelected, and he lashes out at Volodymyr Zelensky. He's made it very, very clear where he stands on this war, and that's not that hasn't caused them to rethink this. I also am just fascinated about who's funding all of this, because often on the right, and I'm sure it's true to a certain extent on the left as well, you always have to follow the money. I mean, who's writing out the check for this? Who thought this was a good idea? But to your point about the isolationists of the appeasers, I would say that they are a fringe in the Republican Party, and all the polls that you cited would certainly document that, except for the fact that the number one Vladimir Putin fan in the Republican Party is the former president of the United States, who is still the leading candidate for president in 2024. And as long as Donald Trump is looming over the Republican Party, and as long as you have the entertainment wing of the Republican Party led by Tucker Carlson pushing these things, I don't think that you can completely write it off. What did you make of the fact that more than 60 Republicans voted against a pretty, I would say, anodyne, non-binding resolution supporting NATO? 63 Republicans voted against the resolution expressing support for NATO. That seems like a really large number to me.
Yeah, I was surprised that some of the folks that were among the those 60 or so people, folks that I would not consider part of the right wing or the NatCon crowd, so to speak. But we always say on this, I always say on this podcast, Twitter isn't real life. CPAC isn't real life. And, I've written
True,
a lot about
true,
how
true.
even Trump's endorsement, we have a bunch of huge primaries coming up in the Republican Party in May. And, to the Trump factor, clearly Republicans still, like Trump, support Trump and entertain and indulge his election conspiracy theories, but he may, as I've written, go 0 for 6 or lose the vast majority of races in which he's endorsed favored candidates, from the Georgia governor's race, where he's backed David Perdue against Governor Kemp. You've got an Idaho governor's race where he
Hmm.
endorsed someone who spoke at a white nationalist conference this year. She's losing badly in that primary, according to the polling I've seen. You have the Alabama Senate
Yeah.
primary, where his
Mo.
MAGA candidate, Mo Brooks, did so poorly in the polls that Trump withdrew his endorsement to save face. So I agree with you, Charlie, that obviously Trump holds a lot of sway within the Republican Party, but a lot of folks, I would also caution not to overstate his impact, not to overstate his
Okay.
influence. If his candidates end up losing the vast majority of races that they're in, his endorsed candidates in the month of May, it may show maybe an early indication that even though he still carries a lot of sway within the party, his word is not the final word when it comes to Republican Party
This
candidates.
is a very, very interesting question, and I was thinking about it before the podcast today, because you are right. He could go 0 for 6 in May. He's likely to have a very, very bad primary, and then of course there's the danger of over interpreting all of that. Our colleague Sarah Longwell tweeted out this morning, "Look, don't misread that as thinking that he's still not the dominant factor in the party, especially when you think about what a presidential primary might look like in 2024. Even if Donald Trump is down to 40% approval rating, you can run the table with 40% of the Republican primary vote. So, give me your take on all of that, because I do think that there is the danger of reading too much into it. On the other hand, it certainly is a counter indicator to those of us who, continue to think that this is, lock, stock, and barrel Donald Trump's party. If his endorsement does not carry that much clout, so I'm kind of, I will admit, I'm wrestling with how much to read into those results. You think that they are likely to be somewhat consequential?
I do, though. my good friend Tim Alberta at the Atlantic
Yeah.
was on your show a
Mhm.
couple months ago, and he had
Yeah.
one of the great lines, which I've written about in my column because I think it's such a good point. He described what's going on in the Republican Party as sort of a merger between the Trump wing and the establishment.
Mhm.
So you have a lot of cases like in Georgia, Trump endorsed Herschel Walker and encouraged him to run. This is someone who has been accused credibly of domestic abuse, has written about his issues in the past. Usually, that would be disqualifying for any candidate. We saw Eric Greitens having to deal with similar issues, and it's a big problem. But because Trump endorsed Walker, and because his endorsement still does mean a lot, the establishment, the McConnell wing of the party, ended up eventually relenting and going along with Herschel Walker's candidacy in Georgia. And look, there are a lot of Republicans privately who, despite this great environment that Republicans are running in, are still panicked that Walker will not be a good candidate and might cost them yet another Senate seat in Georgia. Nevada, you've got Adam Laxalt, who
Mhm.
was the former state attorney general,
Republican.
who entertained a lot of these election denialism, schemes during the post 2020 period, and I believe is backed by Trump, and also has gotten support from the establishment. So you are seeing this sort of merger, if you will. We're now moving the bar, the Overton window, if you will, even further to the right. And there's been an acceptance of some of the more problematic elements of Trump and his behavior. But I do think that that is where the vast majority of Republican candidates are. They're willing to, indulge Trump. They're willing to take the good parts as they see it of his populist approach to governance while trying to distance themselves from the Russia stuff and from the election denialism. And that is the merger that we're seeing, where you're not going to see any. There's no such thing as, like, there are very few, if any, anti-Trump Republicans. That they just don't
Right.
exist in elective office much anymore. Fred Upton, one of the most respected
Right.
Republicans from Michigan, retired because Trump endorsed his opponent, and it made a big difference.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, he voted for impeachment. It seems that one of the sweet spots that some Republicans are looking for is not necessarily to be endorsed by Trump, but just to make sure that you are not denounced by Trump. So, I was talking to some people who were involved in some campaigns, and they were saying that their main hope was just to prevent an endorsement of any kind. That they didn't care whether he supported them, but he just didn't want one of these things going out that they were a rhino. Okay, speaking of endorsements, though, Sarah Palin, the return of Sarah Palin, you have some very interesting analysis of Alaska politics. But before we get to that, because okay, I mean it's going to get a little wonky. Just like, I mean, a little warning here. Sarah Palin emerging from really complete obscurity. I mean, she went from being the sort of the ultimate rock star of the right, the precursor of Donald Trump, to pretty much exiled during the Trump years, too crazy even for MAGAverse. And now she's back, running for this open congressional seat in Alaska. And just to remind people, Alaska has one congressional seat, which means it is a statewide election. So she could have run for United States Senate statewide or run for this congressional seat. She's chosen to run for the congressional seat. There are more than 50 candidates in that race. So, Josh, what give me your sense of, it's like, time is a flat circle and we're back to Palinism.
Well, you make this hugely important point, Charlie, that Sarah Palin was really the precursor to Donald Trump.
Yeah.
That she captured the enthusiasm of the populist wing of the Republican Party in a way that foreshadowed Trump's rise just about 5-6 years later. And I remember covering Palin when I was a reporter at Politico, and the traffic, the engagement with any stories involving her were just like writing about Trump, and it was just like crack cocaine to folks who are in the industry. So Palin coming back almost a decade or more later to run for the House. It's sort of a full circle moment. What's interesting, though, and this is what I wrote about in my column today, is Alaska just changed its election rules. I'm surprised Trump hasn't talked about stealing the election in Alaska from Sarah Palin and his opponent he endorsed against Lisa Murkowski, because
Yeah.
they actually changed the rules last year to incentivize moderates, to incentivize more mainstream candidates, and disincentivize hard right, hard left candidates from succeeding in primaries. So Sarah Palin, she has a decent chance to be the next congressman in Alaska, but she's not going to have a primary where she wins the nomination. she's going to have to go on this ballot with 48 other candidates. You pick the top four vote getters, end up moving on to a general election where Democrats, independents, everyone can vote, not just Republicans. So she's going to have to win over some independents and maybe even some Democratic votes to prevail in a general election ballot with three other challengers. Not very easy. And you can't, even in Alaska, which is a pretty Republican state, you're not going to be able to do it just by winning over Trump voters.
Okay, I'm pretty wonky on this stuff, but I need a refresher course in ranked choice voting. So you tell me whether that I have this right. Okay, I mean how ranked choice voting works, and I have your piece in front of me. Okay, so basically, all the candidates compete in a single primary, right? Democrats and Republicans, right? Everybody with the top four moving to the general election, right? So it's possible there will be four Republicans. It'd be possible that there would be two and two, right, or three and one.
That's right.
Okay,
Yeah.
so in the general election then voters don't vote for one candidate. They actually rank their choices in order from one to four, with the lowest ranked candidate in each round getting dropped until one candidate wins the majority of the vote. So you have to win the majority of the vote. Am I right so far?
That's right, Charlie.
Okay. So candidates, and then as you just made this point, in a ranked choice voting environment, and this is like a whole different world for most of us, they're incentivized to build a broad coalition, which is what makes this so interesting because it is the exact opposite of the Trump strategy of just ginning up a certain portion in the primary base. So without ranked choice voting, the most rabid person in the primary gets the primary. And if you're in a state like Alaska, it's probably close to tantamount to victory. So this is in many ways kind of a dream scenario for election reformers because it is the opposite of the hyper tribalization we see with primary centric elections. In this election, in ranked choice voting environment, you really do need, as you just said, this broad coalition. So the old system would have almost guaranteed a Palin victory. The new system makes it much more complicated.
That's exactly right, Charlie. And by the way, just this week, Senator Murkowski, who's facing this tough
Mhm.
primary from a Trump endorsed challenger, said she would be supporting Supreme Court Justice nominee Ketanji Brown Jackson. That would not happen if it wasn't for this ranked choice system. She would have to appeal to the right, pander to the right if she was facing a traditional primary. But under this new system, she actually her political incentives go the other way, and being bipartisan is a political asset. So that's what changes. This Palin is not going to have this free ride that she probably would have otherwise had under the ranked choice system.
Huh.
It's what, by the way, empowered Glenn Youngkin in the Virginia Republican nominating
Mhm.
process. It helped Eric Adams get elected in New York City in the mayoral race as a more moderate candidate. So this is a very revolutionary change in how we elect candidates.
It is revolutionary, and I feel like I'm sort of have been behind the curve on all of this. How did this happen in Alaska? I'm assuming that the legislature is Republican, that the governor is Republican. So, I mean, how did it happen?
I believe it was a referendum on the
Oh,
ballot. I
interesting.
have to double check that, but
Okay.
it definitely a lot of these changes get made not by politicians, right?
Okay.
Who want to preserve their power. It's usually done at the grassroots level. You're seeing a similar version of that. It's not quite the same, but the state supreme courts that are
Right.
undoing these gerrymanders in states. That is not politicians doing that. It's literally state Supreme Court justices who are not elected, who are have less skin in the game, so to speak, politically, are deciding that some of these maps are just so partisan, so drawn in such a gerrymandered way that they're throwing them out and forcing both sides to come to the
All
table.
right. Well, I want to talk about this is a perfect segue because you just mentioned Murkowski's vote in favor of Ketanji Brown Jackson. Let's talk about the politics of the Supreme Court right after this. Okay, you know that it is almost summer here in Wisconsin, and summer means cooking out, firing up the grill, and that means putting on the steaks and the burgers. And I cannot wait to grill the Omaha steaks that arrived recently in the mail, the beef tenderloin steaks, the ground beef burgers, the pork loin chops. This has been a family tradition for us for many years. I have family that comes over from France, and they understand that it is summer in Wisconsin, summer in America. when we are cooking the Omaha steaks on the grill. Omaha Steaks makes it easy to stock up on all of your favorites. Visit omahasteaks.com, enter Bulwark into the search bar, and order the Omaha Steaks sampler today. Look, we have been giving this sampler as gifts to members of the family for years now, and I have yet to find anyone that is not absolutely delighted when this shows up. You will save more than 50%, plus you will get 12 Omaha steak burgers free with your order. This package has it all, from the mouth-watering butcher-cut filet mignon to the delicious caramel apple tartlets. Every order is backed by their 100% satisfaction guarantee to deliver perfection in every single bite, every single time. Visit omahasteaks.com, type keyword bulwark in the search bar, and order today. Look, there's a reason why Omaha Steaks has been the leader of gourmet steaks and food for more than a century. No one, and I mean no one, comes close to matching the flavor, tenderness, and value of Omaha Steaks. Fifth generation owned and operated, they invented meat delivery and are still the very best. You can trust Omaha Steaks to deliver quality worthy of their name. Visit omahasteaks.com, keyword bulwark, and order the Omaha sampler today. Okay, we are back with Josh Kraushaar from the National Journal. I think your point about Lisa Murkowski voting for Ketanji Brown Jackson is interesting. That if it was not for ranked choice voting, she might have gone the other way. We just don't know. But give me your sense of the way that this has played out, because I think it was a foregone conclusion that she was going to be confirmed for the court, but it feels as if, well, just give me your sense. I mean, Tom Cotton goes to the floor of the United States Senate yesterday and implies that, if she had gone to the Nuremberg trial, she would have defended the Nazis because she had defended some of these people accused of terrorism. It was an egregious cheap shot because, of course, that's what defense lawyers do. But Ted Cruz raising the whole question of being soft on child porn. This had a just give me your sense of the politics of this nomination, because it seemed a little bit different, but maybe it's a continuation of where we've been going, since Robert Bork or since Merrick Garland or whatever. What is your take?
So I think it's telling that the original hit from the right against Judge Jackson was that she wasn't qualified. That her SAT, Tucker Carlson raised
Ooh,
publicly, like, she did, where are her SAT scores?
yeah, right.
And I thought from the standard of just being qualified to sit on the Supreme Court, she did a tremendous job at her hearings. She didn't fumble. She answered every question pretty crisply, and showed as much detail as you will get from these types of Supreme Court hearings. Look, I think the changing standard of how senators look at these confirmation votes, it no longer is about qualifications.
No,
It's about, do you agree with me? Do you, I think that's unfortunate. Lindsey Graham, for example, voted for Judge Jackson on the circuit court, and Senator Graham has candidly and commendably said that has been his standard. He voted for most of Obama's Supreme Court nominees, if not all of them, because he believed that qualifications were the standard, not a litmus test for where you stand on certain ideological issues. Look, it's gotten more partisan since Kavanaugh, or since before then. You mentioned Bork, but it's certainly gotten hyper partisan in the last 5 or 6 years, where it was very rare to find much Democratic support for any of Trump's very qualified Supreme Court nominees, and now Republicans are returning the favor. Simply the fact she got at least three Republican senators to vote for her is actually a sign of strength in these partisan times. But a lot of this, like, I felt like a lot of the rhetoric surrounding her sentencing of predators, child sex predators. Yeah, yeah. I think Hawley and Cruz were trying for their Perry Mason moment, but I don't think it had any legs politically. If anything, it's a larger indictment on the Democratic Party on law and order issues. But I didn't see any real vulnerability from Jackson in terms of her qualifications to be on the Supreme Court.
well, I want to come back to that the point you just made about the vulnerability on the crime issue, but that in some ways was, I think, overshadowed by this emphasis on the child porn, and then you had Marjorie Taylor Greene, who said the Republican senators who would vote in favor of KBJ were pro pedophile. I am just struck by this pivot. How quickly so many people on the right have gone sort of, QAnon adjacent, with, child sex rings and pedophile, and that you are a groomer or you are a pedophile if you oppose legislation like down in, the legislation in Florida. Your sense of this, because I think that, right now, Republicans have the wind at their back when it comes to issues like crime in general on the border, inflation. I'm not so sure this really sort of, hyper anti-gay rhetoric. How does that play? Is that an overreach? What is your sense?
Well, I hate this I mean, this
Yeah.
new era of politics where people just abuse and insult people for political and personal disagreements. I just can't stand it personally. Now, look, I've written about the what Democrats call the "Don't Say Gay" bill, which is a parental, it's essentially a parental rights bill that prohibits, sexual orientation instruction, gender identity instruction in Florida schools. If you look at the polling, it's overwhelmingly popular in the state of Florida and nationally. So they don't need to get into the gutter with this language. It's
Right.
a a lot of the overreach speaks for itself on the left and how they've attacked the bill, misrepresented the bill. It's broadly popular, and what it calls for. There may be some overreach. The language may not be the neatest language in the world, but it's the issues that it claims to advocate for are very popular ones in Florida and beyond.
And by the way,
Um,
that's what you're saying is that for the majority of voters, they see this as a parental rights, parental power piece of legislation rather than anti-gay?
Yeah, they don't think that
Yeah.
sexual orientation should be taught to kindergarten to third
No,
graders.
right.
I mean, it's a pretty popular mantra, and that's the end all of it.
Mhm.
Now there's an additional element to the bill that says in older grades it has to be age appropriate language, and
Right.
that's where I think the
Vague.
language gets a little more fuzzy and a little more problematic. But the meat of the bill, what they're calling the "Don't Say Gay" part of the bill, is simply preventing instruction in gender identity and sexual orientation to kindergartners to third
Yeah.
graders, which I don't know if things have changed that much since I was in school, but that never was taught in the first place, and I don't think it should be taught. It's overwhelming numbers of Americans don't believe it should be taught.
I agree with you, but what concerns me though is the vagueness of the legislation and then this weird new trend in legislation to put bounties essentially on teachers' heads, which is, creating a cause of action so that, some, to use Tim Miller's phrase, panhandle Karen can file a lawsuit against the local teacher if they say or do something that she thinks might be wrong. That just strikes me as being dangerous. And of course, I'm old enough to remember when conservatives were against excessive litigation, the litigation culture. So we'll have to see how that plays out.
Yeah, no, and I don't think there are any bounty provisions in the Florida law, but they did change the language of the K to 3 instruction from discuss. It was originally discussion, any discussion of these issues, and they changed the language to instruction.
Yeah,
So I
correct.
think that made it a little safer, a little more clear and helpful for legislative language purposes.
So again, I want to just to go back to something you mentioned, and I had the same reaction, which was that Republicans didn't need to engage in the pedo grooming rhetoric because the polls would suggest that the whole issue of violent crime is working in their favor. It just strikes me that there's a constellation of issues that I don't think that Democrats have really figured out how to handle: the border, inflation, and crime. You also mentioned, of course, the whole parental empowerment issue. Do you agree with me, by the way, on that your sense is that those are that the winds are blowing against the Democrats on those 4 issues?
I do, and what's very as someone who follows politics, what's kind of frustrating is this is one issue where they are in control of their own destiny. As a political observer, as a political analyst, it's often frustrating to see a party acting against its own self interest. And Democrats are kind of at the point now where they're like, what can we do? There's nothing we can do on the economy or inflation. There's nothing we can do about the border at this late in the game. But when it comes to talking about these cultural hot button issues, involving race, gender, the crime issue, sentencing. Wisconsin, in Wisconsin, the Senate nominee, or I shouldn't say the nominee, but the front runner for the Democratic nomination for the
Um,
Senate in Wisconsin has come out against bail,
I know.
paid cash bail, and double down on that. That is well out of the mainstream, especially in a state like Wisconsin, where
Yes.
the awful crime at the Waukesha parade is
Yep.
still very very fresh in people's memories. But they're choosing to do this on their own. The Democratic Party seems to always be months behind where the population, where the public is, to the point where, now they're saying we don't need masks in schools anymore. Now they're saying we want to fund the police. We don't want to defund the police. They should have said this a year ago. They should have said this more than a year ago. And they've waited so long until the polling was just screamingly obvious that their positions, or that the progressive part of their party's positions on these issues were so problematic. And now they're suffering the whirlwind, and they're still having trouble moderating on a lot of these hot button issues.
Okay, so see, we sort of have a family discussion here at the Bulwark about whether or not the Democrats need to emphasize their centrist identity. And there are those who argue that, well, the Biden administration has been very centrist in its governing, but that's not the way it is perceived among voters who will actually decide the outcome of this election, is it?
Yeah, I mean, and it's not the facts. I think indicate that they've pushed to the left when the sweet spot was always in the middle, and Biden campaigned as a moderate. Whether it was the scope of the initial stimulus, which Biden could have done in a more bipartisan manner, and probably helped the inflationary problem. That he probably could have reduced inflation by not spending so much early on the COVID emergency funding, and gotten some Republicans to support him on that. He didn't have to withdraw haphazardly in Afghanistan, which caused a lot of political problems in terms of his administration's credibility and competence. And look, a lot of these cultural issues, you shouldn't have to. It shouldn't take a year for you to give a State of the Union address calling to fund the police. But they've been scared of their activists within the party that actually don't want to fund the police more. They have some very avant-garde views on crime and policing, and the administration may not embrace those views, but they certainly have run scared of those positions, and don't want to alienate some pretty important elements within their own party.
You mentioned this issue of cash bail and bail reform, which is a very, very hot issue in places like San Francisco and New York, and apparently the leading candidate, Democratic candidate for U.S. Senate in Wisconsin, Mandela Barnes, has embraced it. This is one of those issues that is turning, I think, to be incredibly toxic for the Democrats. You actually have, want to talk about an undercovered story. The shocking recall of the San Francisco school board was just again, to use the word precursor again, a precursor to the recall of the very, very progressive DA there.
Chesapeake.
Yeah, if in fact he is recalled, it ought to be, red flags all over the place that you can be too progressive even for San Francisco. But bail reform has become one of these touchy issues. It's going to be a big issue here in Wisconsin, and if Mandela Barnes is the Democratic nominee, I think it pretty much guarantees Ron Johnson will get another 6 years. Um, and so I think Democrats are saying, well, Joe Biden said that we want to refund the police, not defund the police, but he's only said it a few times, and it doesn't counteract what's actually happening in real time in one city after another, and the number of progressives who still don't make the connection between things like bail reform and the rise of violent crime in urban areas. And that is obviously a huge problem.
Yeah, it's a huge problem, and I think there was some denial after that San Francisco recall of those 3 school board members,
Yeah.
and the excuse was, well, Democrats even supported the recall, and
Yeah.
this was about some local issues, not about the national issues of parental rights and education, and merit and qualifications to be in a magnet school. But now, even though Boudin isn't hasn't drawn the same level of Democratic support for the recall, there have been some new polls showing overwhelming support for his recall as well, because
I know.
crime is on the rise in San Francisco, one of the most democratic cities in the entire country. If Nancy Pelosi doesn't see this, if she that's her neck of the woods, if she doesn't see the political backlash that's emerging in her hometown among Democrats to some of these policies and some of these positions, they're in for a world of hurt unless they turn things around pretty fast.
And they would have to turn around very fast. And of course, you have Eric Adams, who over in New York, kind of raising his hand, saying, "Hey, I'm the tough on crime Democrat. You want to make me the face of tough on crime urban Democrats? I'm right here." And yet, I'm not sure that that is actually happening. So, you had a great piece breaking down the Democrats' strategy to hold on to the House, which, of course, I think it is hardly breaking news that that's going to be an incredible uphill fight. You noted that the first shot was fired by the Democratic aligned House Majority PAC, announced plans to spend 102 $1 million in advertising across 50 media markets nationwide. The Republican Congressional Committee is planning to target 72 Democratic held districts, including 33 that Biden won by double digits. So you're looking over the landscape. Look, I think Republicans are likely to take over, but is it a little bit of irrational exuberance to think that they can target 72 Democratic held districts, or is it that kind of
Well,
be
yeah,
it?
that number is not.
Yeah.
They put a lot of members that they're probably not going to be able to target on that list. So that's definitely a large number. But I will say this, Charlie, that I've been covering elections since 2004, and this is based on the polling, based on how many races are in play relative to the top line numbers in these districts. This is the most favorable Republican environment I can imagine I've ever covered, and it's comparable to 2010, it's comparable to 2014. But I know Mitch McConnell was talking to Punchbowl News last week, and he said that he's never seen an internal poll showing Republicans up more than 3 points on the
Yeah, I
generic
saw
ballot
that.
at this point. He's seen polling in the last few weeks that show Republicans up 10 points on that generic ballot. So this is I mean, we're 7 months out from the election. Things can change, but to make a parallel to like weather forecasting, we are in a Category 5 hurricane watch where there could be a tidal wave.
Okay, so why? Is it all inflation? Is it a perception of Biden's weakness? What? Give me your sense of what is contributing to this. Is it a pro-Republican wave or is it an anti-democratic wave?
It's much more of an
Yeah,
anti-democratic wave. We always see
yeah.
backlashes to the party in power, so the fundamentals would always be in the Republican Party's favor, but not to this extent. And what we're seeing is the economy not being nearly what a lot of Democrats were hoping for out of the pandemic, with inflation being the dominant issue and concern for so many Americans, combined with these cultural disconnects that we've been talking about, where Democrats are actively alienating not just some traditional Republican voters, but even like non-white working class Democratic voters who are much more culturally moderate on all these issues, crime in particular. That's becoming a big issue in major cities. But those are issues where they've alienated actively some of their own voters, no less Republicans or independents. And the three factors I look at, and all of them are pointing pretty strongly towards the Republican Party right now. One is the independent vote. If you look at the independents, Biden has an approval rating among independents in the low 30s. That's about as low as I've seen for any sitting president. It's very comparable to where Donald Trump was in the run up to his first midterm election. You've got a fired up Republican base that we haven't seen in quite some time, eager to vote, eager to vote for their own party on all these congressional races. And maybe most importantly, Charlie, you have a very disillusioned Democratic electorate, which turnout always does dip off. It did for Trump in 18, it did for Obama in 2010. But unlike Obama and Trump, Biden is not a cult of personality president. He doesn't inspire loyalty or passion from his supporters. So you're seeing an unusual degree of defection from younger voters, in particular, African Americans,
Hmm.
to a similar extent. Where Biden won 90+% of African American voters in the 2020 election. His approval rating among African American voters in the last few polls I've seen are in the 60s. Huge drop off, and suggests that they may not be voting Republican, but they're probably not going to show up to support Democrats in the midterm elections. The youth vote is a real problem, and this is why Democrats still do feel the need to appeal to their base. The more progressive voters on the younger side of the spectrum just aren't interested in Biden and interested in voting for Democrats in the midterms. So
Yeah.
you have a perfect storm. Usually, even when Obama had a bad year in 2010, Democrats still showed up. I mean, they still had decent turnout. You may have really weak turnout or surprisingly low turnout, and if that holds, it would be a very bad sign for
So
Democrats.
what is your diagnosis of the Joe Biden presidency? Because he came in, there was some good feeling, his numbers were relatively stable for a while. Republicans were struggling. It seems like a long time ago now, to figure out how to attack him. That's all changed. What happened to the Biden presidency? What is your I'm struggling not to use the word autopsy, but your sense of what happened? Why is Biden right now so unpopular? Which raises the question of course, what can he do to turn it around? But let's start with the first part of that question. What's wrong?
Yeah, so he failed to read his mandate. He got so excited after Democrats, thanks to Trump, by the way, after
Yeah.
Democrats won those 2 Senate seats in Georgia, giving Democrats the Senate majority and the House majority, that he failed to realize that he was holding very narrow majorities, and that so many people voted for him because he wasn't Trump. He was a pledge for a more normal kind of politics, and he achieved something. I mean, certainly it's been more normal compared to Trump, but he immediately thought he was the next FDR or the next LBJ, and had these unrealistic ambitions that were totally delusional, given the realities of where the Senate and House were, given the fact that you still have a whole lot of moderate Democrats making up those majorities in both chambers. So he raised expectations, Charlie, so high that now he's getting blowback not just from the middle, but he's also pissing off the left because they were promised so many things that were unable to be achieved, that now they're even more disappointed than they otherwise would have been. So, I mean, the obvious political strategy, and I wrote about this at the time, I'm not just Monday morning
No, I
quarterbacking
remember
here,
this. Yeah.
was to basically be the boring guy, be the guy who would restore normalcy, play to the middle. You're not going to get the excitement from the base, and you don't have the excitement from the base even now, but you would get some buy-in from the Mitt Romneys and the Susan Collinses of the world. You'd work towards appealing and appeasing Kirsten Sinema and Manchin. And you would do things by governing to the middle, and maybe you wouldn't have these huge consequential legislative accomplishments that I don't think were ever really that achievable, but you could build back better. You might actually be able to win a seat or two in the Senate, given how far to the right the Republican Party is going, right? You could actually maybe hold on to I think it's probably unlikely, but they actually could have made gains if the Republican Party, didn't reform itself, and you're the one governing as the adult in the room and the moderate who's appealing to the mainstream elements in both parties. But he went the other direction. He went to the left, as I've documented and talked about quite a bit, and that had political consequences. You're paying a big political cost for that.
Okay, let me push back on you a little bit, with the caveat that I agree with you, and believed all the things that you just said as well. I mean, I actually was also believing that part of the mandate was to be boring and to be centrist. I wonder now, and again, having accepted everything you're saying about the center and moving left, whether or not our political culture has changed to the point where you no longer have the luxury of being boring. Because one of the things that strikes me is that maybe we got, or at least I'm thinking about, is that maybe we got addicted to Donald Trump being a presence, so that Biden does not seem to have the there seems to be an absence, is what I'm getting at. That he doesn't have the presence, the leadership, the sense of strength that you would want at a particular moment. I remember saying, and you and I probably had the conversation, I'm looking forward to a time when we go days at a time without talking about the president, when the president does not dominate the news cycle. Well, the problem is that every once in a while we need the president to dominate the news cycle. We need to have the president providing that kind of presidential leadership, to be the Churchill or the FDR, in times of crisis, and he's not there. And so, his failure to use the bully pulpit, maybe in reaction in part to the overuse of it by to Donald Trump, I think makes him feel like a diminished president, if you know what I mean. Now there are other issues as well,
Yeah, yeah.
including his age, which I think we'd have to be in serious denial not to see that as a factor. But I wonder whether the modern president can afford to be boring and absent any longer.
It's a great point, Charlie. And I think the problem though was that Biden didn't understand his own limitations.
Yeah,
You're right. You got to understand who you are and what your strengths are, and play to those
yeah.
strengths. He saw himself for a moment as FDR and LBJ, even though he did not share their rhetorical gifts. He didn't have the political capital in Congress. He didn't have the momentum behind their victories, and yet he kind of envisioned himself in that same light, when he's Jerry Ford, right? He's a transitional president who's
Right,
not.
yeah.
I mean, we'll see if he runs again
He
in
knew that.
2024.
He knew that in the campaign, and then he forgot that when he got into office, right?
Right.
You know?
And I think good governance, good politics is all about knowing your strengths and knowing your weaknesses, so you can kind of play to your strengths and downplay those weaknesses. And he did not follow any of that playbook. He literally got eyes too big for the realities in Washington. And Again, I think that's what did him in. I think he could have been a perfectly successful president. He could have been talked about in the history books as the guy who turned down the temperature from the crazy Trump years. And look, I
Right.
think he accomplished some of that. I mean, there's clearly a certain decorum that was absent for 4 years during Trump's presidency. But Ford, one of the most famous things Gerald Ford did in his presidency, was pardon Richard Nixon and almost take that off the table and literally try to cool down the temperature by actively avoiding alienating the reasonable parts of the opposition. Biden didn't really do that. I mean, he literally went as far as he could go with his legislative agenda, to the point where he really alienated a lot of Republicans, the small handful perhaps of folks still in the moderate wing of the party that were willing to do business with him and actually did vote. By the way, they did support his. The one thing he did do that was a bipartisan initiative was the infrastructure bill, and he got 19 Republicans to sign up for that. So that was a hint of what could have been if he took a different direction in his presidency. But
Yeah.
he too often pandered to the left.
This all seems so obvious in retrospect. I mean, the two great sins of a party that comes into power is overreaching and overpromising. So if you overreach, you push things too far, you generate a backlash. But also, if you overpromise and then underdeliver, you run the risk of disillusioning your own base and creating sort of this outright, this outrage that you have been betrayed, and or indifference about turning out. And I think you did that. And again, when you look back in retrospect, he comes in and you have a tied United States Senate and what, a 5 vote margin in the House of Representatives. Um, Almost the definition of self-delusion to think that with those margins, you were going to be able to be the next FDR, LBJ. And I would like to go back and say, how many people in the Democratic Party raised that red flag saying, guys, this is dangerous. That you are over promising, that you are pushing this too far. You have made this dramatic pivot from the way you ran to the way you're governing based on a virtually non-existent majority. And I think we're seeing how that's played out.
Yeah, it's a rough time for Democrats, who I think we've talked about this too on this podcast, Charlie, but they are the more sane party. They have more moderate voters in their party. They're not the voters in the Democratic Party are not beholden to a cult of personality like the Republicans. So it's like I said, as a political analyst watching, how these different parties are acting, I've never seen so much self-inflicted damage for a party that had a lot of political strengths and advantages going into this midterm election. It really is. The Republicans, in a way, like their problem is their voters, right? They are beholden to a party that, as you've noted, 70% think Trump is the greatest thing ever. Democrats have about
Jesus.
half their party, of half their voters identify as moderates, tend to be more pragmatic, agree with a lot of the positions you've been talking about, Charlie. But their donors, their activists, a lot of maybe even some younger staff are pushing them in a very problematic direction politically, and it's
Well,
watching this in real time has been pretty remarkable.
right, and I mean, there are, a couple of, big question marks about this election, including whether or not the Republican crazy at some point is gonna come back and bite them in the ass, that they are overreaching as well, that they are so confident of victory that they're gonna tolerate the Marjorie Taylor Greens, the various seditionists. Who knows what's gonna come out about January 6th, which I don't think is going to be as decisive as Democrats would hope. And we talked about this previously on the podcast, though, Roe versus Wade. If the Supreme Court were to overturn Roe versus Wade, is that anything close to a game changer, or does that change the dynamics of the midterm elections? Do you think?
I think it does a little bit and it benefits Democrats just in terms of getting that engagement to the point where they need it for the midterms. I don't think it's going to be changing the ultimate dynamic of the midterms. But there was a poll or it was an aggregation of polls that NBC News just put out this week, showing that in the last 12 years, that Republicans lost college-educated women by
Yes.
10 points in 2010. They're now, even in this great environment for Republicans, they're losing college-educated women by 38 points. I mean, that is where the abortion issue
Amazing.
comes into play. That is where you're going to get more engagement if the Supreme Court does overturn Roe v. Wade. Again, I don't think it's going to. That's a lot of that's baked in the cake already. I don't think it's going to dramatically change the trajectory of the midterms. But if it helps stem the losses, and I think it will on the margins, that would be a benefit for Democrats.
Josh Kraushaar, it is so good to have you back on the podcast. I appreciate it very much.
Thanks, Charlie.
Josh is senior national political columnist at the National Journal, and he writes the weekly Against the Grain column, and has been a frequent guest on this podcast. We will have you back throughout the year. The Bulwark podcast is produced by Katie Cooper with audio production by Jonathan Siri. I'm Charlie Sykes. Thank you for listening to today's Bulwark podcast, and we'll be back tomorrow to do this all over again.
We're all juggling life, a career, and trying to build a little bit of wealth. The Brown Ambition podcast with host Mandy and Tiffany the Budgetnista can help, with special guest Chris Browning.
I'll give a shout out. I have two coworkers, Mandy, who love your podcast. They found out about me podcasting because of the last time I was on your podcast.
That's
Brown Ambition.
We outed you.
Yeah, you did. So spread it out a little bit further.
Chances are, if you work in an office with Black women, Brown Ambition is somewhere.
Brown Ambition. Listen wherever you get your podcasts. 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 Wherever you get your podcasts.